Endocrinology. Peptide and steroid hormones. How the brain controls hormones. How hormones influence the brain. Individuals were single cells who had to interact with their environment. Then, multicellular life arose, cellular communication. 4 different ways. 1 cell, one cell physically touching another cell. 2 paracrine, short range, a few. 3 neuronal, electrical transmission, very fast, highly specific. 4 endocrine, long range, chemical messengers traveling through the bloodstream, hormones in blood, widespread. What we want to coordinate. Giant transformations. Like metamorphosis. All the cells change in coordination with each other. Puberty. Pregnancy. Organism who get all the cells on the same page, in a particular environment. Stress. Sexual arousal. Peptide vs steroid. Peptides. Made from amino acids, being precursors to proteins. It's hydrophilic, water-loving. Insulin. Vasopressin. Oxytocin. ACTH. CRH. Steroid. Made from cholesterol precursors. They're hydrophobic, water-hating. Or lipophilic, like lipids, cellular membrane made of phospholipid bilayer. Glucocorticoids. Androgens. Estrogen. Structure of hormones. Come from a single precursor. Amino acids equals peptide hormones. Tyrosine equals single amino acids. Cholesterol equals steroid hormones. When they come from the same precursor, they look very similar, but it has just another subchemical shift. It means, having receptors specialized for subtle chemical differences in hormones. Like norepinephrine and dopamine have a slight difference. But if the receptor wasn't able to distinguish those, it would have a drastic effect. Hormones travel through the blood as signals. Neurotransmitter, also chemical, also communicate cell-cell, but they're gonna be just in the synapse. And can be overlap. Neurons that release their neurotransmitter into the blood, at which point they become hormones. Peptide. They're water-soluble. They go freely through the bloodstream. Steroid. Not water-soluble. They need to be bound to a chaperone. Interaction with the target cell. They require specific receptor for each individual hormone. Peptide. Travel freely through the bloodstream, because of their structural properties. They're hydrophilic, prevents them from being able to travel through the phospholipid bilayer of a cellular membrane. So, the receptors for peptide hormones are on the surface of these cells. The receptors are on the cellular membrane. Associated with secondary messenger responses. A peptide hormone binds to a receptor of the cell membrane. Then, sets off the secondary messenger cascade response. It can lead to, when it's a neuron, it can activate or close ion channels. It sets off the secondary messenger cascade that affects proteins within the cell. Having action on proteins within the cell. Go into the nucleus and affect transcription, more in steroids. Peptide, secondary messenger cascades, affecting proteins existing within the cell. Onset tend to be quick. Short duration. Steroid, travel through the blood of these chaperone protein carriers. They get to the cell, and diffuse through the membrane, and bind to receptors within the cell. Steroid go through the membrane binding to a receptor go to the nucleus affect transcription. Onset slower. Long duration. Because it's changing the rate of synthesis of proteins, rather than changing the proteins that currently exist. The receptors are located in the cytoplasm. Hydrophilic equals water-loving equals polar. Hydrophobic equals water-hater equals nonpolar. How brain control hormone release. Glands are specialized structures that release hormones into the bloodstream. Testes, ovaries. Pancreas, release insulin. Thymus, involved in immune system. All tend to secrete a signal. The brain has endocrine glands. Hypothalamus, endocrine gland. It can secrete things into blood. Pituitary. The brain controls, via the hypothalamus and the pituitary, the peripheral endocrine glands. Brain-hypothalamus-pituitary. Pituitary. They're dangling below the hypothalamus. Divided into 1 anterior pituitary. The hypothalamus drop hormones and travel through the blood, and secretes hormones. FSH. TSH. Prolactin. Endorphins. ACTH. 2 posterior pituitary. It's directly innervat, the hormones that are released, are coming out of neurons, and the cell bodies of those neurons are in the hypothalamus. Secretes hormones. Vasopressin. Oxytocin. The brain controls the autonomic nervous system. It sends neurons with their cell bodies in the hypothalamus, and instead of sending it to the pituitary, it sends them down your spinal cord. Hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Adrenal gland. Regulated by the hormones in its environment. Hypothalamus release CRH-anterior pituitary, activates endocrine cells to secrete ACTH-adrenal cortex, release glucocorticoids. It's a stress hormone, like cortisol, to the entire bloodstream. If the cell has a receptor, it will respond. The cells that have receptors for cortisol are in the pituitary and hypothalamus. And the more cortisol you send out, the less ACTH, to stop secreting cortisol. Negative feedback. Hormone action on the brain. A hormone secreted from an endocrine gland has to find the proper receptors to initiate a proper response, and once it binds, it influences the brain. Blood-brain barrier. Constructed by epithelial cells lining the blood vessels extend throughout the brain, which regulates what things can go inside and outside the bloodstream in the brain. Can hormones pass the blood-brain barrier? Because they're epithelial cells, phospholipid bilayer. Steroid hormones are lipophilic, they can pass through blood. Peptide hormones can't pass through just on their own. But there's no problem with peptide hormones getting to the places they need to get in the brain, because they have carries transport. Alcohol can go through the blood-brain barrier, which has effects on behavior. Receptors. You need appropriate receptors for hormones. Glucocorticoid, steroid hormone. Come into the brain, diffuse through the membrane, and bind to the receptors located in the brain. Like in the hypothalamus or hippocampus. So, for every single hormone, we're gonna have unique receptors throughout the body. Mineralocorticoid receptors, like aldosterone. Type of receptors. Different types of receptors for a particular hormone, it can lead to different effects. Like a variation in the type of vasopressin receptor, can lead to monogamous vs polygamous behavior. How many receptors? Higher number of receptors equals higher sensitivity. And vice versa. Affecting the expression of receptors in certain parts of the brain, leads to changes in behavior. The level of hormone can affect the upregulation or downregulation of receptors. You might start with certain number of receptors, and if you flooded with tons of hormones, these receptors will downregulate the number of receptors expressed on the surface of the cell. And vice versa. Hormone action in the brain. Potential effects of hormones on neurons. Once the hormone binds to a receptor, it changes the membrane potential via ion channel, it becomes easier or harder to start an action potential. Steroid hormone binding to DNA, affecting transcription of genes. The genes could be receptors, like down or up regulation. Change in the protein, activity in transport, proteins could be involving with the neurotransmission or formation of synapses, so hormone can impact on those. So, hormones can shape behaviors, by changing the networks of neurons. How hormones affect the nervous system. Stress, glucocorticoids. Sexual behavior, testosterone, estrogen, vasopressin, oxytocin. Aggression, testosterone, glucocorticoids, estrogen, epinephrine. Depression, glucocorticoids, thyroid hormone, estrogen, progesterone, melatonin. So, individual variation on receptors or hormone levels might influence all these hormones, thus in behavior. In short, steroid vs peptide, hydrophobic or hydrophilic, if you need a chaperone. The nervous system control of hormone release. How brain could control peripheral or endocrine glands. And how those hormones influence behavior via neurons.